On the morning of the 29th of July, 1981, a 20-year-old woman in an ivory silk dress with a 25-foot train walked up the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral, past thousands of guests, in front of a global television audience of 750 million people. The official story of that day, the one sold on plates and tea towels and in every souvenir program ever printed, is that a shy kindergarten teacher was walking, wide-eyed and unknowing, into a fairy tale. Years later, on tapes recorded in secret and handed to a journalist named Andrew Morton, the bride described what she was actually doing on that walk. She was scanning the congregation. Row by row, face by face, she was looking for one specific woman, a 34-year-old married mother of two, sitting among the guests by invitation of the groom. Diana found her. She said so herself. The bride wasn't searching the room for reassurance. She was confirming what she already knew. And she kept walking. This is the story of what Diana knew, when she knew it, and why the version where she didn't know was the palace's kindest lie, and its most useful one. The tragic, naïf version of Diana protects everyone except Diana. It lets Charles off the heaviest charge, knowingly importing a woman he loved into a marriage he knew would remain triangulated. It presents the institution as an innocent matchmaker, rather than a machine that required a virgin bride and then watched one be destroyed. And it keeps Diana in the position the fairy tale needs her to occupy: passive, beautiful, deceived. There is real emotional comfort in that version. Audiences have spent 40 years weeping for the girl who didn't know. The documented record tells a different story. It's, by any serious measure, a more interesting one. Diana Frances Spencer was born on the 1st of July, 1961, at Park House, Sandringham, a property the Spencer family leased from the Crown. For the first 14 years of her life, her world was defined by that house, those grounds, and the social circuit directly adjacent to the royal estate at Sandringham. When her grandfather, Albert Spencer, the 7th Earl Spencer, died in 1975, her father, John Spencer, known as Johnny, became the 8th Earl. The family moved from Park House to Althorpe, the ancestral Spencer seat in Northamptonshire. Diana was 14 years old. The two houses aren't comparable. Park House was comfortable. Althorpe occupies 13,000 acres and has been in Spencer family possession since the reign of Henry VIII. Its portrait collection includes Reynolds and Gainsborough. The social world inherited along with the earldom was one of the oldest aristocratic networks in England. Diana's maternal grandmother, Lady Fermoy, was a lady-in-waiting to the Queen Mother. The family was embedded in royal-adjacent society in ways that the naive girl from nowhere framing has always required people not to examine too carefully. She didn't move into the aristocracy when she became engaged to Charles. She had been raised inside it. The Spencers were, in several material respects, older money than the Windsors. What Althorpe taught Diana, and what it would be extraordinary to think it didn't, was how the people in that world actually lived, the arrangements they maintained between official marriages and private attachments, the etiquette of collective discretion, and the fundamental rules of a social world where institutional requirements and personal desire frequently ran in opposite directions. She absorbed this before she was 16. She wasn't naive. She was a 14-year-old girl who moved into one of England's great houses and learned its codes as they were being taught to her by the world itself. In November 1977, Charles came to Althorpe. He was 29. He arrived as Diana's older sister Sarah's companion, her boyfriend, effectively. Lady Sarah Spencer had been romantically involved with Charles since the mid-1970s, and this particular November weekend was organized around a shooting party at the estate. Diana was 16 and peripheral to it. She was the younger sister in the background of someone else's romance. Charles was there for Sarah. He shot with the party Sarah had arranged. He moved through the house with Sarah at his side. The structural fact of that weekend matters enormously and has been consistently underweighted. The first time Diana Spencer encountered the Prince of Wales, he arrived as another woman's date. She was observing how that worked before she was ever a participant in it. She wasn't the object of his attention that weekend. She was the observer of a pattern that was already well established. Lady Sarah Spencer later described herself publicly as Cupid in the eventual match between Charles and Diana. "I introduce them. I'm Cupid," she told a journalist after the engagement announcement in February 1981. That retrospective framing is generous to everyone involved. What Diana saw in November 1977 was her 29-year-old future husband courting her older sister. She filed that information. She kept it. Before Diana entered this story, the position she was eventually asked to fill had a decade of prior history. Camilla Rosemary Shand was born on the 17th of July, 1947, making her just under 14 years older than Diana. The eldest daughter of Major Bruce Shand, a former Army officer turned wine merchant, she was 24 in 1971 and already socially fluent in the world Charles occupied. The Beaufort Hunt, the polo grounds at Smith's Lawn in Windsor Great Park, the country house weekends of the Gloucestershire set. The formal introduction between Charles and Camilla, according to Jonathan Dimbleby's authorized biography, The Prince of Wales, written with direct access to Charles's diaries and correspondence, published in 1994, was arranged by their mutual friend Lucia Santa Cruz at her London flat. The popular version of that meeting, which places it at a polo match, appears to be a compression of subsequent months. Polo was the backdrop for their early courtship, but both Dimbleby's account and Penny Junor's in The Duchess attribute the introduction specifically to Santa Cruz. The year, the people, and the immediate attraction are consistent across sources that otherwise disagree on almost everything else. Penny Junor, in The Duchess, describes Camilla as a twinkly, sexy woman with a husky laugh that men adored, someone possessed of a life force who said outrageously funny things. Jonathan Dimbleby's portrait of Charles in the same period describes a young man marked by deep emotional insecurity, a characteristic self-doubt, in the biographer's phrasing, who feared that no woman he'd want to marry would want to marry him. In Camilla Shand, Dimbleby writes, Charles dared to hope that he had stumbled across a resolution to that conundrum. That isn't the language of a passing infatuation. That is the language of an anchor. There is a genealogical dimension to this connection that deserves naming. Camilla's maternal great-grandmother was Alice Keppel, Alice Frederica Keppel, née Edmonstone, the long-term mistress of King Edward VII from approximately 1898 until his death in 1910. The genealogical chain is direct and documented. Alice Keppel to her daughter Sonia Keppel, then to Rosalind Cubitt, then to Camilla Shand. A biography of Mrs. Keppel notes that Camilla grew up in an atmosphere in which affairs were treated much as her great-grandmother Alice Keppel's had been during the Edwardian court. Whether Charles consciously responded to that lineage, Dimbleby does not attribute it as a stated motivation, remains open. What is documented is that Charles was fully aware of the ancestral parallel. The Vogue account of their relationship notes that when Lucia Santa Cruz introduced them, she reportedly quipped about their genetic antecedents. The historical irony is documented fact. The meaning each viewer draws from, it's their own business. By 1972, Charles and Camilla were romantically involved. The Los Angeles Times, reporting on Dimbleby's biography in 1994, summarizes the relationship as an affair in 1972 when she was single and he was a 23-year-old naval officer. It ended not through choice on either side, but through circumstance. Charles was posted on an 8-month naval deployment. He departed without proposing. He gave no clear signal about what would happen when he returned. The standards applied to prospective royal brides in that era were explicit and documented across multiple biographies. The future queen consort needed to be young, unmarried, and what palace circles of the period called untouched, without the public relationships or professional history that might give a tabloid something to mine. Camilla, by the early 1970s, already didn't qualify. She had what one biographer of the period puts with useful bluntness, a past. She'd had relationships. She'd enjoyed a social life typical of a young woman of her class and era. None of that was compatible with the requirements the institution imposed on a royal bride. Requirements that had nothing to do with compatibility and everything to do with what the crown needed to project. In March 1973, Camilla Shand announced her engagement to Andrew Parker Bowles, a British Army officer. They married on the 4th of July, 1973, at the Guards Chapel, Wellington Barracks, a Roman Catholic ceremony attended by approximately 800 guests, including the Queen Mother, Princess Anne, and Princess Margaret. Charles didn't attend. He was serving aboard HMS Minerva and sent his regrets. 2 children followed, Tom Parker Bowles in 1974, Laura in 1978. Throughout those years, the emotional connection between Charles and Camilla was never entirely extinguished. By the late 1970s, according to Dimbleby's account, it had resumed with real intensity. The polo grounds and country house weekends of the Gloucestershire set, the Beaufort Hunt territory, Bolhide Manor, the shared geography of a social world the institution had tried and failed to close off, functioned as the ongoing backdrop to a relationship the marriage certificates hadn't ended. That was the arrangement into which the last woman before Diana stepped. Her name was Anna Wallis, a Scottish heiress whose social circle called her Whiplash Wallis. She was described in a 1985 Vanity Fair piece as a dangerous version of Lady Diana, tall, blonde. Charles proposed to her twice. She rejected him both times. The relationship developed from late 1979 into the summer of 1980, and its destruction was precise and public in its own way, even if it was witnessed only by those present. During the summer social season of 1980, Charles took Wallis to a succession of balls, country house events that constituted the highest register of their shared social world. According to Penny Junor's account in The Duchess, Charles had taken her to 2 successive balls and spent most of both evenings dancing and socializing with Camilla Parker Bowles. The decisive scene, documented across multiple biographical accounts, occurred at the Queen Mother's 80th birthday celebrations at Windsor Castle. Wallis had been watching Charles ignore her for the evening. She found him. Junor records her reported words, and this is Junor's account, drawing on biographical research rather than any contemporaneous primary record, as, "No one treats me like that, not even you." She left. She married someone else not long after. Tina Brown, in the Diana Chronicles, frames what happened in those rooms in terms that are worth noting. Camilla had had a scare with Anna Wallis and adopted a new strategy. That framing implies deliberateness on Camilla's part that may outrun what can be proved. What is documentable is the pattern's outcome. Every woman who had been in Charles's orbit in those years saw the same information. Every one of them saw that Camilla Parker Bowles occupied a position in his emotional life that his official companionship of them couldn't displace. Every one of them read it. Anna Wallis read it and walked out of Windsor Castle. The information about Charles's attachment to Camilla wasn't hidden from the women around him. It was available, legible, and consistent. What varied was the choice each woman made in response. There is one structural element of this story that explains the gap between what insiders understood and what the public was permitted to know. By 1980, the British press was broadly aware of Camilla Parker Bowles's role in Charles's life. Journalists who covered the royal beat understood the outline. They didn't publish it. The precise combination of convention and calculation that kept Fleet Street quiet held until 1992, when Morton's book forced the story into the open. A Los Angeles Times journalist, writing as late as 1991, framed a Tuscany trip Charles had taken without Diana, with Camilla staying at a villa 30 minutes from his, as mildly curious, rather than as the open secret it was in the circles that mattered. The headline read, "Camilla, always ready to comfort Prince Charles." It was presented as a personal warmth story. Everyone who knew anything understood it as confirmation of something they'd known for years. That press silence is what made the Diana didn't know version so easily sold to the public. The ordinary newspaper reader had no information to draw on. Diana's knowledge came from a different source: proximity, the aristocratic network she'd been embedded in since 1975, her sister's prior relationship with Charles, and the social geography of a world where these arrangements were understood rather than published. The people who knew didn't talk to newspapers. The newspapers, for their own reasons, weren't asking. What that silence produced was a credibility gap. The naive Diana framing could hold only because the press had withheld the context that would have collapsed it. By the summer of 1980, Charles had turned his attention seriously to Lady Diana Spencer. The courtship developed across the following months at Balmoral, Sandringham, and the polo grounds she'd grown up adjacent to. And throughout this period, stranger than the conventional account allows, Camilla Parker Bowles was present. Not as an obstacle exactly, as something considerably harder to categorize. Penny Junor's reading, in The Duchess, is that Camilla extended a degree of welcome to Diana during this period, that the two women were on cordial terms, that Camilla positioned herself as something like a guide to the world Diana was entering. Junor is a biographer explicitly sympathetic to the Charles-Camilla camp. The Times, reviewing The Duchess in 2017, said plainly that she demonizes Diana to sanctify Camilla. That critical context isn't a reason to ignore her work entirely. Some of what she documents is corroborated elsewhere, but it is a reason to hold her framing at some distance and to present it for what it is: one interpretation. What is beyond interpretation is the structural imbalance between these two women's positions in that period. Camilla, born in 1947, had been part of Charles's life for approximately 9 years by the time Diana entered it seriously in 1980. 9 years isn't a phase, it's a formation. She knew his closest friends, his private habits, his preferred social world, his rhythms away from the public role. She hunted with the Beaufort hunt on the same Gloucestershire fields he'd been riding across for years. She knew what he found funny, what he found unbearable, what he needed after a difficult public engagement, and which silences were comfortable rather than awkward. Diana was entering all of that at 20 years old, however well-bred. The gap wasn't just age. It was 9 years of shared history, accumulated emotional intimacy, and social fluency in a world where Diana was still a newcomer, learning the geography from the outside, while Camilla already had the keys. Multiple biographies document Diana feeling out of her depth during the engagement period and early marriage, not because she was socially ignorant, but because the specific interior world Charles moved through was one Camilla had shaped around him. Tina Brown in The Palace Papers notes that even Camilla felt empathy for Princess Diana over dealing with Prince Charles's regimented demands, which is a remarkable sentence. The acknowledgement that Camilla understood Diana's difficulty precisely because she understood Charles's difficulty. Both women, from opposite positions in his life, were navigating the same complicated man. Then came the note. Shortly after the engagement announcement on the 24th of February 1981, Diana moved into Clarence House, the Queen Mother's London residence, ahead of the wedding. On her bed, she found a letter from Camilla Parker Bowles. Diana described finding it and reading it in the audio tapes she later recorded from Morton at Kensington Palace in 1991. Recordings made across multiple sessions, with written questions delivered by Diana's friend, Dr. James Colthurst, who smuggled the cassettes out of the palace. Those tapes became the basis of Morton's 1992 biography, Diana, Her True Story, and his 1997 expanded edition, Diana, her true story in her own words. When we cite Diana's account of the note and what followed, we are drawing on those published transcripts, which are edited extracts of longer recordings. The note, as reported consistently across multiple sources drawing on the tapes, read as follows, and the contents are reported rather than published verbatim from the original document. Such exciting news about the engagement. Do let's have lunch soon when the Prince of Wales goes to Australia and New Zealand. He's going to be away for 3 weeks. I'd love to see the ring. Lots of love, Camilla. Diana's immediate response, as she described it to Morton, was characteristic. Wow, so I organized lunch. She went. She met Camilla at an unspecified location. The Crown placed the lunch at a specific restaurant, but the show's own research acknowledged that detail was dramatic license. The venue has never been confirmed. Diana described the experience as very tricky. According to her account on the tapes, Camilla asked during that lunch whether Diana planned to hunt at Highgrove after the wedding. Diana said no, she didn't hunt. Camilla said she just wanted to know. There are 3 ways to read the note and what followed it. Juner's interpretation is that Camilla was extending a genuine welcome, acknowledging the transition, reaching across the awkwardness towards something like warmth. The second reading is that the note was reconnaissance, Camilla establishing, through the specific question about hunting weekends, whether Diana would be physically present at Highgrove during the country visits that had previously been their shared territory. Diana's own interpretation on the tapes leans decisively toward the second reading. The third reading is structural. Whatever Camilla intended, the note produced an implicit acknowledgement on both sides. She knew Diana knew. Diana knew Camilla knew she knew. In sending that note, Camilla established that the pretense of mutual ignorance was over. The triangle had acknowledged itself, in ink, on a bed in Clarence's house. Whatever remained of the fairy tale's fiction couldn't survive the directness of what that envelope contained. On the 24th of February, 1981, Charles and Diana appeared together on television for the engagement announcement. A journalist asked if they were in love. "Of course," said Diana. Charles paused and then replied, "Whatever in love means." Those 5 words went out to 750 million people, or would go out to that many in a few months' time, in real time. Contemporary press coverage registered the awkwardness and largely explained it away as the prince's philosophical diffidence, his tendency to find simple questions insufficient for the complexity of his emotional interior. Diana heard it. It's one of the most remarkable pieces of publicly available evidence in this entire story. The man who had just proposed to her, answering a question about whether he loved her, with a conditional and a question. She heard it. She processed it. The Morton tapes don't record her commenting on it specifically, but it is part of the documented public record of what her fiancé said on the day they announced their engagement about his feelings for her. In the weeks between that announcement and the 29th of July, 2 objects entered the story that have become central to any honest account of what Diana knew and when. The first is the bracelet. Diana described in the Morton tapes discovering that Charles had commissioned a gold bracelet for Camilla in the final weeks before the wedding. The bracelet was engraved with the letters F and G, the private nicknames they used for each other, Fred and Gladys. That detail is documented across multiple biographies, including accounts drawing on Diana's tapes and elaborated by Christopher Wilson and Penny Junor, among others. The bracelet's framing differs sharply between camps. Junor's account presents it as a farewell gesture, Charles formally acknowledging, before the marriage began, an attachment he was now required to set aside. A closing chapter. Diana's account on the tapes, as reported in the published transcripts, was considerably less consolatory. She described knowing that the bracelet was being prepared. She confronted the friends involved in arranging its delivery. She didn't confront Charles directly. What the bracelet represented in that moment, whatever the sender intended, was a physical object Charles was having made, monogrammed with the letters of their shared private language, in the weeks before his wedding to someone else. Diana had to decide what to do with knowing that. She decided to keep walking. The cufflinks arrived on the honeymoon. According to Diana's account in the Morton tapes, this is her testimony, clearly labeled, she noticed Charles wearing gold cufflinks engraved with two intertwined C's, which she understood to represent Charles and Camilla. She raised it with him. He confirmed they were a gift from a friend. Diana describes what followed in terms of total jealousy and rows that defined the emotional register of much of what came after. The cufflinks are documented in accounts drawing on Diana's recollections and on Juner's research, though their provenance was disputed in subsequent press coverage. Their existence and Diana's reaction to them weren't in dispute. She told Morton she had considered calling off the wedding. The tapes record something close to the phrase, "a lamb to the slaughter," to describe the night before the ceremony, a phrase that has appeared in accounts of the documentary Diana, in her own words, which drew directly on the tapes. But she didn't call it off. The machinery by then wasn't stoppable by a single act of individual will. The dress had been made by David and Elizabeth Emanuel, ivory silk, a train of approximately 25 feet, the longest attached to any royal bride in living memory. The commemorative plates and tea towels were already in production. Foreign heads of state had arranged their travel. The guest list ran to several thousand names. St. Paul's Cathedral had been selected over Westminster Abbey specifically for its larger seating capacity. The choice to use the longer nave and the longer procession route deliberate, a staging decision that would extend the spectacle for the global television audience. Charles had been 32 and unmarried for longer than the institution found comfortable. The pressure for the match wasn't abstract, not casual, and not coming from just one direction. Diana understood all of this. She also understood, by the time she walked into that cathedral, exactly what she was walking into. The morning of the 29th of July, 1981, St. Paul's had been dressed for something the world has agreed to call a fairy tale. The guest list, recorded on the official Wikipedia page for the wedding, includes heads of state across every sphere of British diplomatic influence. Margaret Thatcher is in the pews. So is Nancy Reagan representing the United States. So is François Mitterrand of France. So are the Prime Ministers of Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. Kings and queens from across Europe have sent representatives or come themselves. The carriages outside have been organized by Andrew Parker Bowles, who holds an official equerry role that day. Specifically, he is described in the documented guest records as being in charge of the carriage processions to and from St. Paul's. His wife, Camilla Parker Bowles, is in the congregation. She has been invited at Charles's insistence. She attends the ceremony at St. Paul's. She isn't invited to the exclusive Buckingham Palace wedding breakfast that follows. Diana drew that exclusion, and it held. But Camilla is in the pews. She is wearing a pale gray suit and a veiled pillbox hat. Her son Tom, 7 years old, stands on a chair nearby to see over the heads of the adults. 750 million people are watching on television. It's, at that moment in history, one of the largest broadcast audiences ever assembled for a single event. Diana begins the walk. What she was actually doing during that walk is something she described to Andrew Morton in 1991, across the sessions at Kensington Palace that produced the tapes. The published transcripts, Morton himself noted in the 1997 edition that these were edited extracts rather than complete verbatim records, are consistent across the multiple sources that have drawn on them. This is Diana's account, and it should be understood as her account. I knew she was in there, of course. I looked for her. So, walking down the aisle, I spotted Camilla, pale gray, veiled pillbox hat, saw it all. Her son Tom standing on a chair. That is her phrasing, not frantic, not fearful, methodical. She knew Camilla was present. She looked for her. She spotted her. She saw it all, the outfit, the hat, the child on the chair, and she kept walking. The image of a bride scanning the congregation for the woman her husband loved, finding her, noting the details, and continuing the ceremony. That is one of the most extraordinary passages in the entire documentary record of this marriage. It's also the most precise refutation of the naive child bride framing that exists, because it comes in Diana's own voice, on tape, from a moment of deliberate recollection when she had every reason to be truthful and no reason to embellish. She described her wedding to Morton as the worst day of my life. The official photographs show what every souvenir program reprints: the downcast eyes, the ivory silk, the overwhelming procession. They don't capture what Diana was doing with her eyes. They were trained on a fairy tale. She was engaged in something considerably more deliberate. The question that follows deserves direct engagement. If she knew, why did she proceed? Several factors converge in Diana's own account and in the biographical record. The institutional momentum was enormous. A 20-year-old standing in Clarence House with the world's press camped outside and the wedding machinery at full capacity wasn't positioned to make a unilateral decision about the future of the heir to the throne's matrimonial arrangements. Her own family had actively encouraged the match. Lady Fermoy and the 8th Earl Spencer had both been supportive. Backing out, in a social context where obligation to the crown carried genuine weight, and where the public dimensions of the humiliation would have been extreme, wasn't simply a personal choice. It was an institutional act with consequences that extended far beyond Diana herself. Diana acknowledged on the tapes that she didn't seriously consider withdrawing on the day itself. But there is something in the account she gave Morton that resists reducing her to a passenger in her own story. She knew. She walked in knowing. That isn't the act of a deceived woman. It's the act of a woman who decided, for whatever complicated mixture of love, hope, institutional pressure, 20-year-old courage, and clear-eyed understanding of the odds, that she would go forward and fight for the marriage on its own terms. She had seen how the women before her responded to the same information. She chose differently. That choice, made with full information, is what subsequent history consistently refused to credit her with. The marriage lasted, formally, until the divorce was finalized on the 28th of August, 1996. It functioned as anything approaching a partnership for considerably less time than that. The years in between, the parallel lives, the coldness, Charles's 1994 admission in his authorized Dimbleby television documentary that he had resumed his relationship with Camilla after his marriage had, in his words, irretrievably broken down, belong to accounts that have covered that territory in full. What matters for the argument being made here is the shape of the entire arc and one specific moment in it. On the 20th of November, 1995, Diana gave an interview to Martin Bashir for the BBC's Panorama program. She was asked about Camilla Parker Bowles. 14 years of marriage had distilled her understanding of the situation to its sharpest possible expression. She said, "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." That sentence is the most economical statement of the case she ever made publicly. She hadn't discovered the triangle through Morton's book appearing in 1992. She hadn't arrived at the number 3 gradually through the accumulation of evidence during the marriage. She had known the shape of it before the organ played at St. Paul's. Panorama wasn't a revelation, it was an accounting. She named the number. 3. She had always known 3. It's worth dwelling on what the Diana didn't know version required of everyone who maintained it, and what it produced. It required accepting that a woman who grew up inside the English aristocracy, who watched her sister date the prince, who received a congratulatory note from his former attachment 3 days after the engagement announcement, who sat through a lunch in which that same woman asked specifically about her hunting plans at his country house, who discovered a monogrammed bracelet being prepared for another woman in the weeks before her wedding, somehow failed to form a coherent picture of what was happening. The claim wasn't credible. It was convenient. It was convenient for Charles because it made him look like a man who had conducted himself in good faith, setting aside his past, as the institution required, entering the marriage as required. The inconvenient reading, that he knew he was importing a triangle into a marriage and watched a 20-year-old navigate it without giving her the respect of acknowledging it directly, does not sit well with any version of Charles that the institution preferred to project. It was convenient for the palace more broadly because it allowed the marriage to be presented as a legitimate attempt that simply failed, rather than a structural impossibility that was visible from its inception to anyone paying attention. And it served a specific function in relation to Diana herself. It transformed her from an agent into an object. A woman who didn't know can be pitied. She can be mourned. She is the perfect figure for a certain kind of public grief, beautiful, innocent, destroyed by forces she couldn't see. She becomes the fairy tale's victim, and the audience is invited to weep for what was done to her. A woman who knew and walked in anyway is something considerably more difficult to categorize. She demands to be understood, not just mourned. She demands a reckoning with the complexity of what she chose and why, with the specific kind of courage it takes to walk toward something you can see clearly, knowing the odds, knowing the company you'll be keeping. She isn't a passive surface on which events acted. She is the most active figure in the entire story, the one who, with the fullest information of anyone involved, made the most deliberate choice. The biographers who have pushed hardest against the naive victim framing have had mixed fortunes. Penny Junor's work on Camilla has been criticized for going too far in the opposite direction, for rescuing Camilla by diminishing Diana, as the Times put it, demonizing one to sanctify the other. That overcorrection is its own form of distortion. Diana's knowledge and Diana's agency aren't arguments against her, they are arguments for her, precisely because they restore to her something the fairy tale systematically stripped away, the credit for understanding exactly where she was standing and choosing to stand there anyway. Andrew Morton, who heard Diana's voice on those tapes before anyone else outside Kensington Palace did, understood what he was holding. The first edition of Diana, Her True Story, appeared in 1992 without full attribution to Diana as its primary source. The full picture emerged only with the 1997 revised edition, published after her death, which incorporated the edited tape transcripts under the title, Diana, Her True Story, in her own words. The words are all Diana's. The methodical account of a bride scanning St. Paul's for one specific face, finding her, noting the gray suit and the veiled hat and the child on the chair, and continuing the walk. That isn't the account of a woman who was surprised by anything she found. It's the account of a woman who had been preparing for that moment for months. She was 36 when she died in Paris on the 31st of August, 1997. The arguments about what her life meant continued long after. They continue still, and they will likely continue as long as people are drawn to stories about what happens when individuals move through institutions that are too large to accommodate the full weight of who they are. Every fairy tale has a moment the editors cut. In this one, it's a 20-year-old woman in 8 yards of ivory silk, pausing, just for a breath, to find the face she was looking for. The women before her had seen the same truth and walked away, and history has called them lucky. Diana saw it and walked toward it, and history called her a fool. She wasn't a fool. She was a 20-year-old who understood exactly what she was up against and chose to fight for her own marriage, in the full knowledge of who else would be inside it. The pity was always the wrong tribute. She deserves the one thing the fairy tale never gave her: credit for knowing. If stories like this one matter to you, subscribe. There are more coming.